Ever wonder what your lashes are destined for? The cards have spoken. Maybelline New York Mascara does it all. Whether you crave fully fan lashes with Lash Sensational, big, bold volume from the Colossal, a dramatic lift with Falsies Lash Lift, or natural-looking volume from Great Lash, your perfect lash future awaits. Manifest your best mascara today. Shop Maybelline New York and discover your lash destiny. Shop now at Walmart.
Heather is a nurse practitioner from United Healthcare.
We meet patients wherever they live.
During a house call, she found Jack had an issue.
Jack's blood pressure was dangerously high.
It was 217 over 110.
So they got Jack to the hospital and got him the help he needed.
He had had a stent placed in his heart, preventing a massive heart attack.
If it wasn't for my guardian angel, I wouldn't be here.
Hear more stories like Jack's at UnitedHealthcare.com. Benefits, features, and/or devices vary by plan, area, limitation, and exclusions apply.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Hi, I'm Christy Shriver, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. Today, we continue our discussion of the great 20th century icon, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Last week, we discussed what some consider to be his finest hour and finest piece of rhetoric with his speech, "We Shall Fight." Originally, our goal for today was to look at a little of his political philosophy as it developed over a lifetime and its application for post-World War II, or even for today by reading and discussing his second most famous speech, Sinews of Peace. However, after trying to get it all in under an hour and failing, we've relinquished that idea. We will do the speech over 2 episodes. There's just a lot of historical context, plus his philosophy and thinking are important, not just from a literary and historical perspective, but also from a practical and contemporary one. In many ways, the world has changed. I mean, Hitler is no longer a threat. World War II is over. Even the Cold War is part of history, but we as humans are as we have always been. And this is something Churchill learned over the course of a very long career. And as he worked and traveled as a soldier, a journalist, a politician, and a speaker, he discovered these things. So we will take a little extra time to think through his ideas. We won't tell anyone how to apply them or even if his ideas are the correct ones, but they should not be thrown away as relics of a Victorian day gone by. The threat of tyranny and war are very much just as real today as they have ever been. And today we begin the discussion, and the next episode we will complete it. Most people know this speech as the Iron Curtain speech, but it was a commencement address at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, in the United States. He titled the speech and called it The Sinews of Peace, and he gave it on March 5th, 1941.
There has been so much written about Winston Churchill that has been said that to study Winston Churchill is inevitably to plagiarize the observations of others, which is a kind of funny thing to say, and perhaps it's even true. As I researched for this episode, I discovered there is just no end to the debate about his life, his thoughts, his life work. But as you pointed out, understanding his thinking is interesting. And since he wrote so much himself, it feels possible, at least to me, that this is one person who we can project a little bit because we understand his thinking. What would he think today if he looked at our geopolitical landscape, even though it's over 100 years since he began his military career as a soldier. But as we look at the title of the speech, we see that although Churchill was a soldier, unlike many people say, he wasn't really a warmonger. He was accused of it, but he knew the cost of war. He felt the loss of dead children. He wasn't afraid of war, but he wanted perhaps more than anyone to be an architect of peace. So the title of the speech is Sinews of Peace, and it's an interesting choice of words. I mean, sinews, that's a science word. It's a biology word. It relates to the science of life. Sinews are those fibrous tissues that hold muscle to the bone. And of course, this is a metaphor. The speech is a blueprint. It's a plan. Maybe you could say it's a vision. In his speech, Churchill is very specific about what America must do if we are going to hold together this world that we live in through peace. And yes, he sees America, he's British, but he sees America as being central to how peace will be achieved on planet Earth. He's very clear about this. He's very bold about this. And unlike the "We shall fight" speech, this speech is not greeted with roaring applause and positive accolades in the newspaper. In fact, it was the opposite. It wasn't well received at all. Not by people on this American side of the Atlantic and not by people on the other side of the Atlantic when he gave the address. However, lots of the ideas in the speech have actually aged well. And today it's still controversial, but it's less so. The question we want to ask ourselves as we read it is if he's right from a philosophical standpoint. Is what he claims to be the sinews of peace really how peace is held together? Is America still central to world peace? Why does he even feel that's the case in his day? And if it is the case, what does that mean for the rest of the world? What does it mean for Americans? Today we live in a world that has way more nuclear weapons than in Churchill's day, and in some ways it's more volatile for other reasons. What are the sinews that hold peace on earth and promote goodwill towards all men?
Well, do you think you've asked big enough questions? Yeah, that's pretty insurmountable right there. But to get to Churchill's position on this topic, we will need to back up a little bit. We will not be giving Churchill's complete biography. There's enough written about that if you're interested. But suffice it to say, if we did, most would conclude that his ideas and even his person were nothing if not unorthodox and even controversial from the beginning. First, he did not come up the ranks of power in the traditional way by attending the great British universities of Cambridge or Oxford, where many British and world leaders have been educated. In fact, he had no formal university training at all. In that sense, he was very much a self-made man. His father, Lord Randolph, was titled, but Winston did not inherit his title. In fact, until 1953, when Queen Elizabeth knighted him as Knight Companion of the Order of the Garter, he had no title at all. Now, his mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American, a socialite from New York City who, after marrying Lord Randolph, went by the name Lady Randolph for the rest of her life. So there are two things that are unusual, but there was a lot that was unusual. He was an MP for over 60 years. He changed parties not once, but twice. He engaged with most of the big political issues and controversies of his day. And when he did, it was often thunderous and many times not well received. And yet, no one denies his place in history. He was the lone prophet crying in the wilderness, to use a biblical analogy, warning Britain and the West against the threat of Nazi Germany and later on the Soviet Union. In both of those cases, history proved him correct. He was a strong supporter of the creation of Israel and a vehement defender of the Jewish people. However, he was also a strong supporter of the British Empire, which, according to the views of many American opponents, kept 1 out of 4 humans on Earth in bondage, which was an interpretation of colonialism that Churchill did not share. Others have said, and quite accurately, it was his view on colonialism that was a blind spot that led him to underestimate and even undervalue people of color in general, as was seen in the Bengal famine and all men's desires for independence. And again, a blindness most obvious in regard to India and Mahatma Gandhi. And all of this, of course, can be true. He was a man of his day as well as a man for all time.
In his autobiography, My Early Life, he himself described himself as a child of the Victorian era, and he was. He comes by his imperialism honestly. He was born in 1874 at the height of the British Empire. Another major influence in his life, though, beyond the era in which he lived, was his father, Lord Randolph. Lord Randolph was a politician, and Winston revered him when he was a child. However, the relationship with his dad wasn't reciprocal. Lord Randolph did not hold his son in high regard at all. In fact, he didn't see a lot of promise in his son. His son struggled academically. Winston got poor marks. He had trouble staying focused in class. So instead of university, where a lot of his contemporaries were going, Lord Randolph arranged for his son to have a career in the Army. So Churchill attended Sandhurst Military Academy before taking up a commission in the Army. But despite his father's lack of faith in his son, Churchill actually did well at Sandhurst, even academically, and it was enough to impress his father. And right there at the end of his schooling, he finally got his father's attention.
Well, before we feel too sorry for Winston Churchill and his being denied a college education, let me say that an education at Sandhurst is still a very impressive opportunity. Sandhurst, which is the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, is the British Army's initial officer training center. It's world-renowned and very competitive to get into. But unlike its American counterpart, West Point Academy, it does not offer degree programs. Its primary purpose is to provide intense military and leadership training and not academic or graduate work in the traditional sense. And in the case of Winston Churchill, that's exactly what happened. Churchill was there for around 15 months. He graduated 20th in his class of 130 and took up his commission in December of 1894. In January of 1895, his father, Lord Randolph, died, and that was a devastating blow to the young Churchill, who was just beginning to build a relationship with his father. And the combination of these two events, many have argued, is where Churchill really got his drive in politics. But Westminster was not the beginning. India was. His regiment was bound for India to Bangalore, which is about as far as Winston was the end of the world. He would be in India for a total of 19 months in various places. Churchill fought the assignment, pulling every string that he could find. He knew he needed to stand out in the Army, and that meant bravery in battle. He also knew that a career in politics meant self-improvement intellectually, and being just as a soldier wasn't going to be enough. So he decided to improve himself on both fronts, if you'll pardon the pun. He decided he would put himself in as many battles as he could possibly find, and he would read as much as he possibly could. And he would self-educate himself, and he would demonstrate enough bravery to become a hero. That was the goal. That was the plan for young Winston.
Well, and he also wrote, don't forget that, between 1895 and 1900, that's 5 years, he wrote 5 books, including a novel. But he wrote tons of letters and memorandas. He did everything he could possibly do also to become that hero on the battlefield. I want to quote a letter that he wrote to his mother, Lady Randolph. This is what he said. I rode on my gray pony all along the skirmish line where everyone else was lying down in cover. Foolish, perhaps, but I play for high stakes, and given an audience, there is no act too daring or too noble. Without the gallery, things are different.
Oh, that's honest.
I know. On another occasion, he wrote this about this particular period of his life. I do not believe the gods would create so potent a being as myself for so prosaic an ending. I mean, this is a funny quote, but you can see, he held himself kind of in high regard.
He did. I just want to point out there are many, many parallels with our Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, wow.
But we won't digress on that. But there is it's an interesting personality type. So you can also see from that last quote that you read that some people found him just a little too arrogant to be likable. I wonder why. But on the other hand, he really was brave. He fought in the cavalry, artillery, infantry, regional or territorial with the guards or on the line. He just wanted to be in the fight. And I'll give you an example. During his first year, he used his 2.5 months winter leave not to go on vacation, but to go to Cuba to observe the Spanish colonial forces fighting the Cuban freedom fighters. And in fact, it was in Cuba that he came under fire for the first time in his life, as did Roosevelt, I'll point out. After that, he fought in several other campaigns, often against men Churchill called valiant savages. One other example that stands out is when he took part in what we now know as the last cavalry charge in British history. It was the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan. At Omdurman, the British suffered only 49 casualties, but because of their superior weaponry, they killed 11,000 dervishes and left another 16,000 wounded on the battlefield, where Churchill would have seen British soldiers walk through the wounded and stab them with their bayonets. We also know that this was morally challenging for Churchill to reconcile in his own head. He for sure believed in the superiority of his own people, but he still highly respected the men he was fighting and deeply acknowledged their humanity. And in this battle, there was a lot of one-sided death, and all of this had to be reconciled in his mind. In Churchill's way of thinking, by conquering a people, the British were actually elevating and protecting their culture. So even though you may not agree with his colonial thinking of the time, there are some important takeaways beyond that. First, he saw death of his enemy as something awful and costly. He did have a moral compass. He also saw what happens when one side of a conflict is technologically superior to the other. And vastly superior technology all but ensures a no-contest battle.
Well, Churchill came back to England after the Battle of Omdurman with a different view of the world. His worldview was constantly evolving, and it was different from his contemporaries, obviously, who had spent their last few years at university and then become members of parliament in uncontested constituencies. I mean, Churchill ran into a few of these guys who had the job that he wanted with little to no effort of their own. And this is what he had to say about his encounter with his contemporary friends. Naturally, I was on my mettle, and not without envy in the presence of these young men, only 2 or 3 years older than myself, all born with silver spoons in their mouths, all highly distinguished at Oxford or Cambridge, and all ensconced in safe Tory constituencies. I felt, indeed, I was the earthen pot among the brass. The conversation drifted to the issue of whether peoples have a right to self-government or only to good government. What are the inherent rights of human beings, and on what are they founded? From this we pushed on to slavery as an institution. I was much surprised to find that my companions had not the slightest hesitation in championing the unpopular side of all these issues. But what surprised me more and even vexed me, was the difficulty I had in making plain my righteous and indeed obvious point of view against their fallacious but most ingenuous arguments. They knew so much more about the controversy and its possibilities than I did. My bold, broad generalities about liberty, equality, and fraternity got seriously knocked about. I entrenched myself around the slogan, "No slavery under the Union Jack." I soon felt like going on to St. James Street or Piccadilly and setting up without more ado a barricade and rousing a mob to defend freedom, justice, and democracy. After this encounter, I had the idea that I must go to Oxford when I came back from India.
So,
what do you think of that?
Yeah. I love the way he states things. And you can see from even before his political career was about to start, he found himself taking strong moral opinions that were contrary to whatever was trendy. And it wouldn't be too much longer till his platform would be a lot larger. And when the South African War broke out, Churchill went back to the action. This time he would be a war correspondent. And on November 1899, he is in an armored train that was ambushed, and he was taken as a prisoner of war. He, in heroic fashion,
of course,
broke out of the prison camp and survived to tell the tale. And that's a fascinating story in its own right. The story was dangerous. It was sensational. And when Winston Churchill returned to England, he came back a famous war hero. So
even before Instagram.
Right. He ran for political office. He was elected. And perhaps even more impressive than that, he went on a 5-month lecture tour in Britain and in the United States, capitalizing on his fame and bringing home a sum of £10,000. That's a pretty hefty
He learned to
picture.
monetize.
He did. He monetized. So by February of 1901, he was giving his first speech in Parliament, and it was powerful. He spoke with inside understanding about the South African War, and he spoke with generosity towards enemy soldiers. He demonstrated respect to them. This position was controversial, but it made him popular among people who understood the difference between soldiers and governments that sent them to war. Parliament knew from the get-go he would be a force. The problem was his often oppositional views. His public life was stormy and strenuous, just the way he wanted it. Combative.
This might be a good time to interject that although his political life would always be contentious, I mean, one nice and really, I think, unexpected thing about Churchill is that nothing about his marriage was contentious. And this was in a lot of adversity where things weren't easy. In the spring of 1908, Winston met Miss Clementine Hosier. They were married in September, not long after, and in his words, again to quote him, they lived happily ever after. I mean, this woman must have been a saint, because there is no way it could have been easy to live with him personality-wise. But even if he had had the pleasantest personality in the world, the things that they lived through would have been hard on any marriage. But he called her Clemmy, and she pushed herself, their family, her husband through every crisis. And she was described as being a woman of grace. She restrained Churchill on many occasions. She advised him. She gave him courage. She steadied his impulsivity. That's recorded many times. And she was the primary parent. She raised their children. Life would not be easy for her personally or politically. But in fact, in 1908, neither of them would have imagined the world events that would forever define the Churchills, Great Britain, or really the world. For a while there, Churchill, and this is before World War I, obviously, he's just another up-and-coming politician, fighting for causes he believed in, moving up the ranks, like you would expect. All the way through World War I, his career was increasingly solid, working in the right direction. In 1911, he's appointed by the Prime Minister to be the first Lord of the Admiralty. Now, this is the civilian head of the Royal Navy. That's an incredibly important position. So things are going well.
They are. So Churchill later claimed his 4 years in that position until 1915 were the happiest of his life. However, it did not end well, and it was in this role that he oversaw the Gallipoli campaign in World War I, which, as we know from history, was a total and indescribable disaster for the British. The Allies' failure in this campaign resulted in heavy casualties and a forced withdrawal. It was awful. It was a public relations nightmare, and although Churchill wasn't really solely responsible, as the top naval officer, he did bear some responsibility, and Churchill resigned over the failure. But what is interesting is what he did after the resignation. And let me read his resignation. I therefore ask you to submit my resignation to the King. I am an officer, and I place myself unreservedly at the disposal of the military authorities, observing that my regiment is in France. I have a clear conscience which enables me to bear my responsibility for past events with composure. So Churchill took up a military post, and he went to the trenches to fight as the battalion leader of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. His men, as you might imagine, were a little skeptical.
I bet they were.
But he did earn the respect of his troops. I just want to point again another Teddy Roosevelt parallel, but I will digress. He regularly visited the sentries, often went into no man's land on patrols, and he wrote Clemmy about it, and he had this comment. Filth and rubbish are everywhere. Graves built into the defenses and scattered about promiscuous feet, clothing breaking through the soil, water and much on all sides, and about the scene in the dazzling moonlight, troops of enormous rats creep and glide to the unceasing accompaniment of rifle and machine guns and the venomous whining and whirring of bullets which pass overhead. November 15th, 1915, shades of the book All Quiet on the Western Front.
I mean, trench warfare sounds absolutely beyond awful. I mean, and it's amazing that he never seems to get hurt or obviously killed, and he has no qualms about stepping into any kind of danger.
Indeed, and he did come close a few times, to be honest. He wanted to be there. In a letter to his mother, he said this: "I always get on with the soldiers. I do not certainly regret the step I took. I know that I am doing the right thing out there." So now, the reason I bring this up, and we don't have time to go through this entire political career, but over his entire career, Churchill took responsibility for great successes, and there are going to be many, but he also took responsibility for his own great failures, which we see him doing at this point. And his reaction to setback was never withdrawal, but engagement. And this is a theme in his life, and it's a theme in his writing, and it's a theme that we see in the speech that we're going to read. The Iron Curtain speech is in some sense a response to a failure. In fact, the reason he is available to give the speech at all is because of a great failure. And as most of us know, Churchill led Britain throughout World War II to defeat the Nazis. And we read the "We Shall Fight" speech last episode, which was at the beginning of the Great War. But Churchill's engagement in World War II changed the world, and there's no doubt about that. His famous V kept Britain in the game until the advent of the Americans and the push by the Allies from both the East and the West towards Berlin, and the end of Hitler's Nazi regime. And the war ends on May 8th, 1945, which is VE Day, victory in Europe, where Germany unconditionally surrenders its military forces to the Allies. In July 1945, not 2 months later, Churchill is defeated in the British general election. In other words, he and his party are thrown out of office.
Which is crazy. I mean, he literally just won the war.
British politics, it's just their own thing. So, this was personally devastating to be the hero of World War II, and then your services are no longer needed. And it would have been the most natural thing to do to retire. After all, he was 70 years old. World War II was all-consuming, to say the least, but he didn't. He was concerned. He had strong convictions, and he was absolutely compelled to speak, as he's always been his whole life. The speech we're discussing today was given in March of 1946, so less than a year after the end of the war and his dismissal from office. After losing the election, Churchill received hundreds of invitations to lecture, as you might imagine. Now, suddenly, one of the men most associated with the Allied victory is unemployed, and he's available to speak, as our past presidents are now. One request came to him in October by the way of the United States President Harry Truman, so that's a bit of an elevated invitation. He forwarded it from a college president, Frank McClure, from Truman's home state of Missouri. And who else's home state is Missouri?
Yours.
And one of the most important things about Harry Truman I would like to point out is that Harry Truman and I are from the same town in Missouri, Independence, Missouri.
There you go.
So, Truman wrote on McClure's letter, "Hope you can do it. I'll introduce you." Churchill accepted. He had something he wanted to say, and this was the stage. Truman apparently had something he wanted Churchill to say as well. There is a little drama and not a little speculation as to how all this came about, but at the end of the day, Churchill's going to speak in Missouri. I can't think of a more obscure place for one of the victors of World War II to speak than the small, tiny town of Fulton, Missouri.
Well, I can only imagine that everyone in the whole world wanted to know Churchill's thoughts at this moment. I mean, not just on the war, but on this configuration, which is the post-war. He had bravely saved the war, in large part due to his ability to see what was going on and to communicate what was going on to people in a way they could understand. I want to read what British physicists, I think this is so insightful, British physicist and Churchill's scientific advisor during World War II, Frederick Alexander Lindemann, he said this about his boss. I think this is very interesting. He says this about his boss, Winston Churchill, after working with him throughout the war. He says, "I've always looked upon Mr. Winston," well, he's called him Mr. WSC, "as a scientist who has missed his vocation. All the qualities, or as the humaner elements might prefer to say, the stigmata of the scientist are manifested in him. The readiness to face realities, even though they contradict a favorite hypothesis. The recognition that theories are made to fit facts and not facts to fit theories. The interest in phenomena and the desire to explore them. And above all, the underlying conviction that the world is not just a jumble of events, but there must be some higher unity. The facts fit together. He has preeminently the syntactic mind, which makes every new piece of knowledge fall into place and interlock with previous knowledge, where the ordinary brain is content to add each new experience to the scrap head. He insists on fitting it into the structure of the cantilever jutting out over the abyss of ignorance.
Oh, my gosh. That's a lot of words to say he's a really smart guy.
Well, and that he sees things.
Right. And that's a great way to say it. He can't be gaslit, to use the expression that we would use today. And he was able to get past what people said and actually observe what people were doing and then draw conclusions from their actions, not their words. He had done it his whole career. That was his secret power. Except that that's not a popular power to have. World War II was over. The war had been long. So many men and women had died. And this was right after a devastating war just one generation previous to that. The West was killing itself one generation at a time. No one wanted to consider the thought of another world threat. No one wanted anyone to project anything but peace and post-war prosperity into the future. But Churchill was not a wishful thinker. He was seeing what he was seeing. And he was highly concerned about Soviet behaviors after the war, and he was about to sound the alarm siren, and it's not going to be well received.
Well, his speech may not have been well received after he gave it, but when Churchill arrived in America, he himself was well received. The Fulton speech was on the tail end of what was a 7-week vacation in South Florida. He ended the war in bad health, and his doctor asked him to get away. So really the purpose of his time in Miami was to recover from bad health, which he did do, but of course there were lots of festivities. He received an honorary doctorate from the University of Miami, their luncheons, other engagements. He painted landscapes. He walked on the boardwalk. He gave autographs. But he also honed this speech for Fulton. In February, American Secretary of State James F. Barnes visited Churchill in Florida and discussed the ideas for the speech that the former prime minister would include. In March, after the send-off at the Miami Surf Club, where, by the way, there were 300-plus admirers, Churchill and Clemmy joined Truman in Washington for the train trip to Fulton, Missouri. But on March 3, Byrne visits Churchill again in Washington to go over this speech at the British Embassy.
Truman didn't read it, anticipating that the Soviets would accuse him and Churchill of ganging up on Stalin, but it seems unlikely to me that he did not get a full report as to what was really in the speech.
Oh, for sure. And this is relevant because of how it goes over. The world is watching. The New York Times said it would be, and I quote, a most important one containing frank discussion of the international tension created by the Soviet diplomatic tactics and an appeal for close Anglo-American cooperation in meeting all world issues, and the New York Times would not be far off the mark. Truman and Churchill met briefly at the White House on the afternoon of the March the 3rd, and of course headed to the station where they would catch the train for Missouri.
Now, Fulton is small. It only had about 6,500 residents at the time. And to get there, they took 2 different trains. They went first to St. Louis, then to Jefferson, Missouri. Then they got in a car and drove the hour and a half into the little town, or as you would say, the interior. Okay. When they got there on that day, over 30,000 people crowded the streets to see Churchill. And there were children sitting on rooftops waiting to watch the limo pass. And the college gym at 3:45 in the afternoon was jam-packed. And can you imagine being a graduate on this day?
No, that would be so cool.
You're graduating from a small, tiny private college in Missouri, and here is the leader of World War II speaking at your commencement.
Well, let's begin. And I will read the speech, as most of the commentary will come from you. I am glad to come to Westminster College this afternoon and am complimented that you should give me a degree. The name Westminster is somehow familiar to me. I seem to have heard it before. Indeed, it was at Westminster that I received a very large part of my education in politics, dialectic, rhetoric, and one or two other things. In fact, we have both been educated at the same, or similar at any rate, kindred establishments.
I'm going to tell you, this is something of a joke. I have been to Westminster in London. I have been to Westminster in Fulton.
They're not kindred spirits.
They ain't the same place, as they say. So anyway, the Palace at Westminster is the building where the British Parliament meets. And so this small town of Missouri, not the same.
Well, let me continue. It's an honor, perhaps almost unique, for a private visitor to be introduced to an academic audience by the President of the United States. Amid his heavy burdens, duties, and responsibilities unsought but not recoiled from, the President has traveled 1,000 miles to dignify and magnify our meeting here today and to give me an opportunity of addressing this kindred nation, as well as my own countrymen across the ocean and perhaps some other countries too. The President has told you that it is his wish, as I am sure it is yours, that I should have full liberty to give my true and faithful counsel in these anxious and baffling times. I shall certainly avail myself of this freedom and feel the more right to do so because any private ambitions I may have cherished in my younger days have been satisfied beyond my wildest dreams. Let me, however, make it clear that I have no official business or status of any kind, and that I speak only for myself. There is nothing here but what you see.
So this is a really important qualifying comment. What he's saying is, I do not speak for the British government. I'm a private citizen, speaking as a private citizen. However, I do know what I'm talking about. I have a lifetime of experience to speak with the utmost authority about the topic that I'm getting ready to address.
Yeah, I want to point out that although he is adamant that he doesn't speak for the government, everyone knows he's influential in government. American Representative William Berry of New York said this at the time: "There is no one, in my opinion, who knows it so well." And what he's talking about is the Russian world policy. Everyone wants to know, what does Churchill think about the Russians?
Exactly. And this is important as we understand this speech today. As everyone knows today, the Western Front of World War II and the fight against the Nazis ended because the United States, Britain, and the Soviets, or Russians, invaded the European continent and they destroyed Hitler. However, after the war, where the United States and Britain retreated home, the Soviets did not. The Soviets continued to occupy the nations that it had marched through during the war, including half of Germany. And this new configuration of the world was really alarming for a lot of reasons. And this is the climate in which Churchill was stepping into. And on February 9th, Stalin made a speech that was received as being a very hostile speech, both in Washington and in London. A ring of Soviet spies had just been caught in Canada. There were other events leading world leaders, including Truman, to fear Soviet imperialism, and where the world wanted nothing but the end of war. Churchill and also, I believe, Truman were very worried that the Soviet Union was not done expanding its empire and saw the weakened condition of Europe and the world as an opportunity. And there's no doubt that Truman read and approved of Churchill's speech and was letting the old dog take a hit for saying out loud what he was likely thinking, but was in no position as the elected president of a war-torn nation really could even verbalize out loud. This speech moved from positive to negative, and Churchill is taking his listeners into the Cold War era. Churchill's criticism of Stalin and the Soviet Union is the first time anyone has criticized the Soviets or Stalin since the Nazi invasion of Russia in June of 1941. Both Churchill and Truman must have known. Churchill was taking one for the team, as we say here in America, and he can get away with this because he is not a public official at the time. And I would like to point out that Truman is going to validate him later on with something called the Truman Doctrine, completely solidifying Churchill's opinions.
Well, let me continue in Churchill's words. I can therefore allow my mind, with the experience of a lifetime, to play over the problems which beset us on the morrow of our absolute victory in arms, and to try to make sure, with what strength I have, that what has been gained with so much sacrifice and suffering shall be preserved for the future glory and safety of mankind. The United States stands at this time at the pinnacle of world power. It is a solemn moment for the American democracy. For with primacy and power is also joined an awe-inspiring accountability for the future. If you look around you, you must feel not only the sense of duty done, but also you must feel anxiety lest you fall below the level of achievement. Opportunity is here now, clear and shining for both our countries. To reject it or ignore it or fritter it away will bring upon us all the long reproaches of the aftertime. It is necessary that constancy of mind, persistency of purpose, and the grand simplicity of decision shall guide and rule the conduct of the English-speaking peoples in peace as they did in war. We must, and I believe we shall, prove ourselves equal to this severe requirement. When American military men approach some serious situation, they are wont to write at the head of their directive the words, overall strategic concept. There is wisdom in this, as it leads to clarity of thought. What, then, is the overall strategic concept which we should inscribe today? It is nothing less than the safety and welfare, the freedom and progress of the homes and families of the men and women in all the lands. And here I speak particularly of the myriad cottage or apartment homes where the wage earner strives amid the accidents and difficulties of life to guard his wife and children from privation and bring the family up in the fear of the Lord and upon ethical conceptions which often play their potent part. To give security to these countless homes, they must be shielded from the two giant marauders, war and tyranny. We all know the frightful disturbances in which the ordinary family is plunged when the curse of war swoops down upon the breadwinner and for those for whom he works and contrives. The awful ruin of Europe with all its vanished glories and of large parts of Asia glares us in the eyes when the designs of wicked men or the aggressive urge of mighty states dissolve over large areas the frame of civilized society. Humble folk are confronted with difficulties with which they cannot cope. For them, all is distorted, all is broken, even ground to pulp. When I stand here this quiet afternoon, I shudder to visualize what is actually happening to millions now and what is going to happen in this period when famine stalks the earth. None can compute what has been called the unestimated sum of human pain. Our supreme task and duty is to guard the homes of the common people from the horrors and miseries of another war. We are all agreed on that.
So this is Churchill setting the scene as he does, and as he likes to do in the last speech we looked at. And we cannot have war, but we also cannot have tyranny. And tyranny is defined as a ruthless dictator imposing his will on others. It's the opposite of what the West really understands to be freedom. And Churchill is observing that the U.S. is at the pinnacle of world power. This was not the case before World War II, but it was the case emerging out of World War II. In Churchill's mind, this comes with a responsibility. The U.S. must be accountable to itself to make itself a protector of the world's freedom. It's really almost a spiritual calling, but you see him declare how peace is achieved. Peace through strength, to use an American phrase. But he will also invoke this new entity that has been created to help preserve the peace. He calls it a temple of peace, and we call it the United Nations. And he's willing to give the UN a chance, and he believes that it must be done, but he's not willing to trust the peace of the world to an organization that can easily be corrupted.
Our American military colleagues, after having proclaimed their overall strategic concept and computed available resources, always proceed to the next step, namely the method. Here again, there is widespread agreement. A world organization has already been erected for the prime purpose of preventing war, UNO, the successor of the League of Nations, with the decisive addition of the United States, and all that means is already at work. We must make sure that its work is fruitful, that it is a reality and not a sham, that it is a force for action, not merely a frothing of words, that it is a true temple of peace in which the shields of many nations can someday be hung up, and not merely a cockpit in a Tower of Babel. Before we cast away the solid assurances of national armaments for self-preservation, we must be certain that our temple is built, not upon shifting sands or quagmires, but upon the rock. Anyone can see with his eyes open that our path will be difficult and also long. But if we persevere together, as we did in 2 world wars, though not, alas, in the interval between them, I cannot doubt that we shall achieve our common purpose in the end.
So let's talk about the United Nations for a moment. And what is it? In 1945, at the end of the war, 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to draft and sign the United Nations Charter. The goal of this organization was to prevent another world war. It was ratified by China, France, the Soviet Union, the UK, and many other signatories. And the headquarters are on the banks of New York City's East River. And it has a General Assembly, a Security Council, an Economic Council, an International Court of Justice. And it certainly has evolved over the years. For example, today it's made up of 193 member states. But the stated objective is still to provide a place where all the nations of the world can come together and resolve conflicts as well as other problems and do it peacefully. And this was the objective from the beginning, and it remains the objective. Churchill was very much an enthusiast about the United Nations, and he played a key role in its creation, and he supported the use of British troops in the United Nations missions, such as during the Korean War. However, he also understood there would always be limitations as to what it would be able to do, and he understood the reasons why it would always be an imperfect institution.
I have, however, a definite and practical proposal to make for action. Courts and magistrates may be set up, but they cannot function without sheriffs and constables. The United Nations organization must immediately begin to be equipped with an international armed force. In such a matter, we can only go step by step, but we must begin now. I propose that each of the powers and states should be invited to delegate a certain number of air squadrons to the service of the World Organization. These squadrons would be trained and prepared in their own countries, but would move around in rotation from one country to another. They would wear the uniform of their own countries, but with different badges. They would not be required to act against their own nation, but in other respects, they would be directed by the World Organization. This might be started on a modest scale, but would grow as confidence grew. I wish to see this done after the First World War, and I devoutly trust it may be done forthwith.
So you can clearly see that he envisions a United Nations that has a peacekeeping force, but is also free from corruption. And, he referenced the League of Nations, and that was the world organization that was created after World War I, really with the support of President Woodrow Wilson, but not the United States as a whole. It was a very divisive political issue. And the League of Nations failed, and it did not prevent World War II. It did not prevent Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Churchill has high hopes for the United Nations, but he's very cautious. The UN can be used to preserve peace, but it also can be what he calls a cockpit in the Tower of Babel, which is a funny expression to me. To say an organization that will be an organization that could drive us to destruction. He wants to trust in the United Nations, but not enough to give it nuclear technology. That he wants to keep securely in the hands of the British and the Americans, who he trusts a lot more. He's terrified that this awful technology would fall into the hands of reckless tyrants, and his experience in the Sudan, among other and even more recent examples such as Nagasaki and Hiroshima, it's a vivid and personal reminder of what superior technology does to an opponent.
It would nevertheless be wrong and imprudent to entrust the secret knowledge or experience of the atomic bomb, which the United States, Great Britain, and Canada now share, to the World Organization while it's still in its infancy. It It would be criminal madness to cast it adrift in this still agitated and ununited world. No one in any country has slept less well in their beds because this knowledge and the method and the raw material to apply it are at present largely retained in American hands. I do not believe we should all have slept so soundly had the positions been reversed, and if some communist or neo-fascist state monopolized for the time being these dreaded agencies. The fear of them alone might easily have been used to enforce totalitarian systems upon the free democratic world, with consequences appalling to human imagination. God has willed that this shall not be, and we have at least a breathing space to set our house in order before this peril has to be encountered. And even then, if no effort is spared, we should still possess so formidable a superiority as to impose effective deterrence upon its employment or threat of employments by others. Ultimately, when the essential brotherhood of man is truly embodied and expressed in a world organization with all the necessary practical safeguards to make it effective, these powers would naturally be confided to that world organization. Now I come to the second danger of these two marauders which threaten the cottage, the home, and the ordinary people, namely tyranny.
All right, so let's review his points so far. First, the United States has an obligation to help the world live in peace. Secondly, we should put hope in the United Nations, as it is a hope for peace. However, the most powerful weapons in the world should stay in the hands of the United States and Britain, where we can trust that they will be used to protect freedom and not promote enslavement. In the second part of the speech, he's going to talk about communism. And this is the threat for which Truman invited him to speak. What we will hear him say is that there are states, and the Soviet Union was the threat in his mind, that will have either single dictators or a party of dictators that will create a political police state where the masses of people are subjugated to the will of the ruling class.
So, obviously, beyond keeping nuclear weapons at bay and the creation of the United Nations, these two ideas, one could argue, are outdated and kind of his moment. What else does Winston Churchill think creates sinews of peace?
Oh, there is way more. And although he does get into the specifics of his day, I do think he extrapolates over time and space. So even if you're not a historian, if you're living in a world of conflict, which we all are, I think it's safe to say that there are still a few Churchillian ideas that we should at least consider as we think about our own future. So, as we pause this speech for the time being, and before we get into the next level of what he's going to discuss, I want to stop and say thank you for listening today. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and as we continue to discuss Winston Churchill in the first half of his famous Iron Curtain speech, we hope you'll join us next episode for the conclusion, where we get to the famous phrase as well as his famous conclusions. So we'd like to invite you to follow us on all of our social medias. Check out our website, howtolovelitpodcast.com. And once again, we thank you for helping us make literature available to the world.
Peace out.
Ever wonder what your lashes are destined for? The cards have spoken. Maybelline New York Mascara does it all. Whether you crave fully fan lashes with Lash Sensational, big, bold volume from the Colossal, a dramatic lift with Falsies Lash Lift, or natural-looking volume from Great Lash, your perfect lash future awaits. Manifest your best mascara today. Shop Maybelline New York and discover your lash destiny. Shop now at Walmart.
With the Redfin app, you'll know the moment your next place hits the market. Whether you're looking to buy your dream home or rent a sweet apartment, give Redfin your gotta-have-it wish list of property features, and you'll receive real-time notifications tailored just for you. Ready to see it up close and personal? Scheduling a tour is just a tap away. Don't wait to find your perfect match. Download the Redfin app and start searching today.
Heather is a nurse practitioner from United Healthcare.
We meet patients wherever they live.
During a house call, she found Jack had an issue.
Jack's blood pressure was dangerously high.
It was 217 over 110.
So they got Jack to the hospital and got him the help he needed.
He had had a stent placed in his heart, preventing a massive heart attack.
If it wasn't for my guardian angel, I wouldn't be here.
Hear more stories like Jack's at unitedhealthcare.com. Benefits, features, and/or devices vary by plan, area, limitation, and exclusions apply.